My name is Anneke Hackenbroich. I'm the Digitization Project Officer for the Vindolanda Trust. This lecture series is as well part of the online exhibition, Digging Up Memories, Making Connection. Welcome to today's online lecture, The Archaeology of Vindolanda's Wooden Underworld. First of all, I would like to welcome and thank Andrew Birley for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much, Anneke. Thank you. I'm just going to find the lecture there and share the screen. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this talk this evening, wherever you are. And I hope you're all fit and well and looking after yourselves. And everybody's settled down for a good evening's entertainment this evening for the lecture about Vindolanda and this archaeology. It's a great pleasure to be able to speak to you tonight. Now, normally when I talk about Vindolanda excavations, I talk about a specific campaign, something that we're currently involved with or a particular area that we've looked at. And to this evening, I want to be a little bit more broad and more encompassing about the archaeology of the wooden underworld and how that's been encountered, how it was discovered, and how the topography of the site really has a huge influence on where this sort of material can be found. For those of you who aren't familiar with Vindolanda, Vindolanda is a small auxiliary fort at the edge of the Roman Empire. It started out life as part of the Staingate frontier system. And what you can see here in red is the little line of the Staingate Road, linking Corbridge in the east to Carlisle in the west. And Vindolanda is one of the many forts that were built along that road in about AD 85, a timber fort. And of course, it's the wooden underworld that we're interested in this evening. By the time Hadrian's Wall is built about a mile to the north of the site, which is the black line you see here from Newcastle Wallsend all the way up to, we've got Solway, of course it extended down to Maryport along the coast. Vindolanda was on fort number 5. 5 consecutive forts built one on top of each other in that landscape. And every time they build a new fort at the site, they bury the remains of the early one a little bit lower, a little bit deeper down in the stratigraphy of the archaeology. And by doing so, they create those anaerobic oxygen-free conditions. So when we look at the site today, and there's a nice aerial view of Vindolanda, actually this was taken before we started the recent work on the southwestern quadrant of the last stone fort. So this is a photograph from, I think it's 2016 or 17, so it's slightly old. But you can see the position of the 3rd century fort in the landscape, 3rd, 4th century fort, this playing card shape all the way around. And then, of course, the extramural settle behind it. Unfortunately, of course, what you can't see there, what you can't detect, are the multiple layers of timber work and early remains in the landscape. That fort you're looking at today is fort number 9. It's the last fort to be built at Vindolanda. And of course, all those successive forts, as I said earlier, bury that wonderful landscape that was there when the Romans first arrived, and they create the conditions in which wood and leather and textiles can be preserved under the ground. You can see Hadrian's Wall snaking away in the background here in the slide, the 9 nicks of Thirlwall, and the long straight line of the Staingate Road that runs straight past the site very, very dramatically. Now, what you're looking at in the 3rd and 4th century there is Vindolanda at one of its smallest extents. And the earlier forts, some of them are 2 or 3 times the size of the footprint of the stone remains you see there. And so they're encompassed almost entirely, those forts, by the 3rd century fortifications and also the extramural settlement as well. And so you've got to get under the buildings, under those remains to get the first contact with the timber archaeology that lies below. The lion's share of the credit for the discovery of the wooden Vindolanda has to go to Roman Vindolanda and his team, my dad, who was excavating on the site in the 1970s, 80s and 90s. But it was in 1971-72 when he started working in the extramural settlement outside the walls of the 3rd century fort. He's standing in the Severan commander's house here. And those early excavations really focused on the top layers of remains. But the site was very, very wet, and it was creating lots of difficult conditions for the excavators. So as they continued to work in the 3rd, 4th century stone buildings at the site, they decided to start putting some field drainage in to drain the excess water away from the site, completely oblivious, unaware of the fact that underneath those stone buildings were timber remains. And of course, Once they'd planned and mapped in the timber work, they started, sorry, the stone buildings, they started lifting some of the stones out to get underneath, to put in the pipes. And when they put those pipes in, or they started that process, they encountered an entirely different universe on an archaeological scale. And here's an earlier photograph of some of the heavy stone foundations of the town buildings outside the walls of the 3rd and 4th century fort. And then you can see under those foundations the heavy rubble that was used to prop those buildings up. And then the remains of timbers and posts and post pits, wattles and daub fences, earlier streets, all appearing under those buildings. Of the many different fort layers that are in Vindolanda that Robin encountered in the 1970s and the 1980s. Underneath where this team of suitably dressed 1970 folk are excavating, you know, there are another 5 or 6 timber buildings to go down, in places giving 6 or 7 meters of archaeological deposits at its greatest depth. Now, the thing that, of course, strikes you most startlingly about this sort of material, if you were a visitor to the site or you weren't aware that this work is going on, is the incredible smell that comes from those remains. Once this soil is uncorked, the gases start coming out of the soil, methane and other gases, things that have been bottled up for thousands of years, and they hit your senses straight away. You can almost smell the decay happening right now when you're working in those levels. It's very immediate. And of course, in a sense it is, because things have been in a former stasis for thousands of years, and when the oxygen starts coming in, then that rotting process starts to happen all over again. Of course, it was some of the discoveries that were made of wood that came out of those excavations which really propelled Vindolanda into a completely new universe in archaeological terms for our understanding and appreciation of Roman Britain through mainly things like the writing tablets. And the first writing tablet was found more or less by accident by my father. He was working on one of the muddiest parts of the site, and he was absolutely shattered by the work he was doing. And he bent down and picked up an oily piece of wood, and he just rubbed it gently between his fingers just to see what it felt like. And as he did so, the 2 pieces of wood came apart, and he was confronted with the document you're looking at right now, staring him back in the face. You can see this letter with the text coming across, 1, 2, 3, 4 lines of text and a bit of another one at the top. You can also see the wood is slightly singed or burnt around the outside. Another problem for writing tablets is they do get used as fire lighters as much as they get used as paper once they've had their primary life. And this first tablet was to sort of set the tone, really, of the personal nature of these discoveries and the insights they give us going forward from this moment in 1973. And this is, for me, my favorite tablet, because it's not only is it my favorite because it's my first, but it refers, of course, to a letter being sent to the soldiers and a parcel at Vindolanda. And in that parcel, this letter says, by the way, say hello to your messmates, and we're sending you 2 pairs of socks, 2 sets of shoes, and 2 pairs of underpants. The only reference to underpants we've got, I think, in Roman Britain. So a first for Vindolanda, a first for Roman Britain. And again, showing you the difference in survival and the difference of detail that you can get from those archaeological deposits where practically anything can survive. But most importantly, perhaps, the writing material and the written word are therefore the dreams and aspirations of the people who lived at Vindolanda at that time. As the excavations continued across the center of the site, more and more timber buildings were uncovered. More and more archaeology started to come out, and a greater depth of deposits started to being encountered. You can see here from some of these pictures, these are images from the 70s and the 80s. You've got Professor Andrew Birley, Robin's brother, working at the bottom of this trench, and his wife Heidi. Just how deep some of those excavations were. And the other striking thing, I think, from the images is just how black the soil is. And again, this is a product of the oxygen rotting things for the first time in 2,000 years. Very often when we encounter this material for the first time, it's not black at all. It's green, it's yellow, it's got colors in it. If you were to find a flower, it would still briefly have its color if it was buried quick enough. But after 3 or 4 minutes, it goes brown and then it goes black as the oxygen starts to take a hold and starts to chemically change the nature of the thing that you're looking at. Of course, As he continued excavating, more and more wooden writing tablets came out, thin slivers of wood about the size of modern day postcards made of birch or alder, covered in ink writing. And some of those texts were truly sensational. They gave us little nuggets of information which we couldn't get, as I said earlier, from any other source. This is another one of my favorite because it refers to the nasty little Britons, people like me, and it's the earliest sort of rude swear word we've got from the Romans referring to the native population in my area. They call us Britunculi. Here we are, there it is, nasty little Britons, absolutely fantastic. Of course, we have a whole cast of characters who start to emerge from these swampy, dark levels, this wooden underworld. They start to appear and they add life and vibrancy to the people who lived at that time. Another favorite, and I've indulged myself this evening, folks, I apologize, I've picked a few favorites, is this guy, Virilis the vet, a man who's lent his castration shears to another vet. He hasn't had them returned and he's bloody annoyed. And we've got this sense of his annoyance in a letter that survived today. Other groups who are almost invisible archaeologically in the normal sense, such as slaves, because they use the same material culture, the same bowls, the same forks, the same spoons, not forks, well, unless it's an oyster pick, the same spoons as everybody else, the same stuff, the same sort of shoes. They're writing to each other. So again, these hidden people who we certainly suspected would be there in large numbers are starting to be given voices through their letters, their correspondence, either directly, like this letter between two slaves, or indirectly with slaves mentioned or being sent on various tasks through the documents and through the tablets. And again, we get not just their names, but a sense of their personality. This letter between two slaves is referring to the Saturnalia, the special winter celebration when the slaves and masters swap roles for the day. And it's full of words we're not exactly sure 100% what they mean, because this is a language that's evolved at the time between that particular set of people, and it hasn't been written down by monks and scribes and great works. And so a lot of the translations haven't come through to modern times. But eventually, perhaps, if we get enough of these documents, just like the good folk of Bletchley Park during World War II or other periods, we may actually be able to crack some of those codes and get a sense of what they're talking about. And of course, things like the birthday party invitation, the letter from one commanding officer's wife to another, the letter from Claudia Severa to Sulpicia Lepidina, who is based at Vindolanda, inviting her to a birthday party. And I put this in the same bracket really as the slaves, in the sense that these are people who are very poorly represented really from a lot of archaeological material and records, and their written word sensationally poorly represented. But yet here we are on the frontier before Hadrian's Wall, having these ladies and other people writing to each other and carrying on quite a very civilized life. Now, of course, through the course of Robin's excavations, then what happened next, several themes started to come out, several things that we had to take note of when dealing with this material, so we could understand what was going on with the preservation landscapes in the wooden underworld. The first is that the actual ancient topography of Vindolanda was very different from how the site looks today, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. Vindolanda, basically, a little bit like Rome, was built on a couple of hills. Well, Rome was on 7, Vindolanda was only on 2, thank goodness, but they have had a major impact on where this material survives and to what depth it does and where it doesn't. You then have an interchangeable nature between areas that are heavily waterlogged, such like ditches, deposits, and wells and drains, and other areas which are wet or damp, but mainly anaerobic, different types of preservation. And sometimes what you'll find is the anaerobic can be suspended above a waterlogged layer and then buried deep below another one. So as you excavate the site, you're going to encounter lots of different types of preservation layers as the work continues. And that gives you survival pockets in the landscape. So where the Romans have dug a big hole effectively and filled it in the right manner, you may have a very good chance of getting good things coming out and getting some good information. But this could be in a relative desert or paucity of an area where no other timber work or anaerobic or waterlogged material survives. It's very patchy because of the nature of the topography of the landscape and how the Romans have demolished the site. But the one thing that hasn't changed from Roman's times in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s is that it is fiercely complicated and difficult getting into those levels of the site. And this is mainly because above the wooden underworld, you've got all those stone remains and buildings which have continued to be constructed at the site, and they're equally part of the World Heritage Site. They're a very important part of the history of Vindolanda, and they're part of the World Heritage Site and its protected monuments. So we have to work within the framework of those later buildings, and I'll show you a little bit of that in a moment, to be able to get down to look at this earlier material. But let's deal with the first question that I raised there before we get anywhere else. Vindolanda, and again, like the aerial images, or the one you can see behind me, you've got the outline of the 3rd and 4th century fort, this playing card shape, very, very clear in the landscape in this laser scan. You've got the remains of the extramural buildings that go with that, and this is the car park if you come and visit the site today, in the museum in the valley in the wooded area, and you can clearly see the hill or the outcrop that the last fort is built on. And that outcrop indeed was there in a form or another for the first fort at the site too. But on the other side here, you can see a natural ridge curving round, which sort of gets a little bit lost where the cursor is with the bathhouse, and then reappears on this side near the replicas on the south part of the site. In ancient times, that ridge went all the way through the site right to the other side and created a valley between the fort and the extramural settlement on the other side. So the first fort of Vindolanda was built on this little island, this outcrop, this atoll, sticking out. It's surrounded by steep-sided slopes and valleys. But as time went on, they started crossing that valley, building forts which are much larger and encasing the valley inside the foundations or the walls of the fort. And as new forts were built, basically what happened is the valley between was slowly filled in with debris and material. So you get different preservation on the slope on the west, and different preservation pockets on the areas to the east. And the deepest preservation, where Robin started his excavations down here in the 1970s and 80s, is where you get the best buildup of material, where you can have wattle and daub fences, timber buildings standing 5-6 feet high, well over 1.5 meters, even in some cases 2 meters, still being preserved. But on the shoulders of the hillsides on either side, a very different story. Now, added to this, you've got where the natural flow of water runs through this landscape. So the arrows I've just put on this plan here show you the fall, if you like, for where rain and water traverses the Vindolanda landscape. Most of it comes from the west, and it flows down towards the east, down effectively what is the main street in the 3rd century. But it's always done this, flowing in this direction, and then it gets siphoned off either to the north or the south. And of course, any rain or springs on the main fort site there from the 3rd century flow, of course, naturally off the hillsides. So you've got this rather complicated topography and landscape. You've got a complicated system of flow of water through that space, which of course then is mucked about with by Roman engineering, Roman ditch digging, Roman building and raising levels, giving us those different pockets of preservation. So we're going to look at 2 or 3 different areas of the site and see how that actually plays out for the wooden underworld at Vindolanda, the archaeology of the wooden artifacts and the preservation layers physically in that landscape. There's Robin's excavations there, his principal work, and that's the site of in the the 1970s and 1980s. And the blue shape here is the outline of our 4th fort at Vindolanda, the biggest one that was constructed on the site between 105 and 118 AD. That's when it was occupied by the first court of Tungrians. And you can see it neatly crosses that sunken valley that lies between, which I showed you a little bit earlier. That is the praetorium of the slightly early period 3 fort, which Robin excavated in that space. And it's incredible, bearing in mind the images I showed you just a moment ago of how he managed to pull that plan together when he was 6 or 7 meters deep, and water was pouring into his trench, which you had to pump out, and all the basic surveying equipment and tools and equipment they had back in those days compared to the digital total stations and drones and other things we've got now. It's absolutely incredible. So we'll bear that in mind also as we continue on with the excavations. I'm going to come back to this praetorium at the very end of the talk with some exciting developments that may go forward into next year. So what are we going to look at? Well, we're going to start by looking at this area here, which is under some 3rd and 2nd century temples at the western part of the 3rd century and late 2nd century town. So there's the fort, there's the town, and we're at the edge of the settlement there, and we're under the 2 little buildings that are marked, which are both temples in a temple complex. We're still, however, within the foundations or the boundaries of the timber fort. Let's have a look and see what survives in that part of the site, where we're getting close to the top of the hill on the western side. Well, here's the excavations of the temples. They're big, heavy stone foundations, and set between them and underneath them, you've got the holes there from pits, which were dug to insert timber buildings from the earlier timber forts. And unfortunately, the floors for those structures are completely gone. They've been wiped out, taken off the top of the hill by the excavation and the reuse of that site in the 3rd, 4th, and other centuries and other periods. And they've been taken away by the Romans. However, the natural boulder clay in this area of the hillside is a fantastic preservation agent. And you can see when the excavators drop down just a little bit more, just another 20 centimeters or so, sitting in muddy pools of water in the trenches that were cut to insert the posts, the top of the posts starting to appear. And as we got down a little bit deeper, you can see that some of those building structured posts are absolutely massive. Now, these are built out of oak, which have very good survival rates in the natural clay soils of Northumberland, and particularly at Vindolanda. And when you go and visit the Wooden Underworld exhibition in the museum, you'll see posts of this sort of size, which can only be pulled out by a digger because they weigh a couple of tons, actually on display, conserved in the museum. And they represent trees that were growing 200 or 300 BC that have been cut down by the Romans in the late 90s or early 2nd century to be used as foundations or uprights in their buildings at Vindolanda. And absolutely incredible. And they take us all the way back through that early period. Now, they're probably stuck in this landscape because they're too large, these trees, for the native population to bother with. It's a lot of effort to cut down a massive oak tree. If it falls down, fair enough, but otherwise, leave it alone. But for military engineers at the site, Roman army engineers, they'd have looked at trees like this and just rubbed their hands together and they went for it. And that's why they're preserved today in the soil. Let's come down the hill a little bit further. We're going to look at this area here, an area that's half in and half outside the northern defences of the same fort. Again, under the extramural settlement, we started to come down the slope 30 or 40 meters from our previous place we were looking at. And as we do, we can see that we're getting a greater depth of stratigraphy. There's a more build-up of material on the site as the Romans are leveling things off. But where things are naturally sitting in a dip or they're starting to slope down the hill, then they're not being quite so savage when they're doing that. So this gives you a sort of an idea of the view of where the excavation is. There's the 3rd century and 4th century fort wall. We're at the edge of the town here. We've got aqueducts coming down to the 3rd century bathhouse. And as we take another look here from a top-down view, we can see what looks to be natural boulder clay, and then a huge number of drainage channels cut through that clay to supply water to various different parts of the fort and the extramural settlement. This waterlogged area, slightly on the left-hand side of the slide, is a filled-in remains of a massive fort ditch. And this massive fort ditch, Hadrianic in date, the Western Hadrianic fort ditch of Vindolanda, full of organic material, did an incredible job of hoodwinking the archaeologists and disguising what was underneath the clay just on the other side. We thought that clay was natural because it had nothing in it, no charcoal, no pottery, no bone, nothing at all. But we got a heck of a surprise in 2012, 2013, because we put a little foundation trench through there just to prove it was natural, and we were wrong. Because under that clay, we started picking out the remains of black soil and turf and timber buildings. And what had happened here is that when the Roman army had dug the ditch, going through natural boulder clay, they'd upcast the clay, covering earlier Roman buildings and preserving them and sealing them in anaerobic conditions. And if we hadn't dug that little trench a little bit deeper, we would never encountered or understood that, because a few meters further up the slope, it was indeed natural clay and there was no preservation remaining. But what we had here was a pocket of preservation. And inside that pocket was some fantastic buildings, extramural buildings, part of the town outside the wall of the fort between 105 and 118 AD. And what was fun about this is you've got two very different types of structure here. You've got a rectilinear building, which is a traditional Roman sort of house. And then this thing on the right-hand side, a roundhouse, is more the local vernacular architecture, the sort of homes that local people in our area in the north of Britain are living in at this period of time. And they're side by side, these two structures. Now, it's too simplistic to say, okay, if you live in a roundhouse, you must be a Briton. And if you live in a square house, you must be Roman. We can't do that. It's too simplistic. I mean, why can't we have a Roman living in a roundhouse just to see what it's like? It could have happened. You know, we've got to be careful with it. But when we looked at the material culture, it started giving us some interesting stories about how this space was used. Not only did we look at the architecture and how these buildings are put together, but we look at the stuff that's found in the floors. And the first thing you can see on this image are two quernstones. There's a traditional quernstone in the middle of the floor here of the rectilinear building. And this is the remains of a bun quern, which is a much more local style quernstone inside a roundhouse. So we're not just getting vernacular architecture, we're getting artifacts which are more traditional for the local use of making bread and preparing food. The artifacts from the building were in fantastic preservation because it was anaerobic. So here's one of the coins, a coin of Nerva that came from the excavations, and you can see it's got a little bit of degradation on it, but this required very little conservation due to its preservation condition. And Nerva, of course, is it's a fairly old coin when it's dropped here. It's 15 or 20 years old, probably by the time it's in the ground. The brooches and other items of dress and material culture were in sensational condition because of the anaerobic preservation. And of course, this is just one of the 130 items of leather, footwear, and bits of tent that we had from that very small survival pocket encased in clay of a couple of different buildings from the extramural settlement. If we look in plan format at the two structures, we can see something else which I'm no doubt Barbara will talk about more in her talk, but survival of wooden artifacts which are to do with personal grooming, combs, and some of the things that one might find in the combs also, because when you get anaerobic conditions, everything survives. What I think is fun about this, however, just from a personal grooming perspective, and Barbara may disagree with me, you'll have to tune into her talk to find out her real opinion. She won't share it here, I'm sure, is that we've got more combs, more evidence of personal grooming in the British house and around about it than we do in the Roman style one next door. So what does that say about those nasty little Britons? Well, they might have been nasty little Britons, but by God, they were good looking in comparison to the Romans next door. Now, if we continue down the slope, further into the belly of the beast, if you will, that deep ravine that the Romans fill in over time, in this space here, things start to get fiercely complex. We get a greater depth of material, a greater build-up, and we also have a water management problem that the Romans had to face and to deal with themselves multiple times. In 2018 and 19, we excavated this space, and we were looking for Antonine fort ditches and Severan ditches, and then whatever else may have survived in between. And actually what we encountered, as you can see in this plan here, is a fiercely complex area with multiple forts, ramparts, ditches, and buildings, all intersecting, crisscrossing one over another to a depth of 5 or 6 meters below the ground of the turf level that's there today. This is an aerial view of that excavation. You can just get a sense of it from this, how complicated this space is. You can see the curving edge of the 3rd century fort here with the angle tower and the temple to Jupiter Dolicanus. This is a little causeway which was built across to reach the fort wall. And we've got the surviving Antonine fort wall coming under here with its ditches on this side. And then above that, we've got the remains of extramural settlement drains of the 3rd century, cobbled yards, 3rd century workshops, and goodness knows what else. A fiercely compact space, but also a very deeply preserved and buried space. And as we started excavating the cuts, the very neat cuts for the Antonine Fort ditches and the other associated buildings from the mid-2nd century down, we started to encounter some really interesting material for the ditches and the ramparts and the timber and the preservation coming through. We did have one problem though, which is that the gods, if you like, the Northumbrian weather gods, were prone to throw everything they could at us in the same way they did to Robin and other excavators of the site. And so, of course, this again combined the two aspects of the archaeology of the site, this wetland landscape and the anaerobic. And sometimes through excavation, we introduced one to another. However, water could be pumped out, and it was. And as the excavations continued, we encountered the rampart rafts, which are spectacular timber edifices, timber and turf, from the earlier periods of the Roman forts, crisscrossing some of those earlier ditches from even earlier forts, one on top of another, like Jenga, like a maze. You can see here multiple periods of timber work surviving. The timber rafts themselves, which are made of oak, and then these uprights, which the excavators are carefully working around, which are surviving elements of the timber building below the rampart or raft, which itself crosses over a Roman fort ditch. Now, at least 60% of the surviving timber work at Vindolanda will be in the form of rampart rafts, rampart revetments, or other material associated with those very, very big building structures, the monumental, if you will, timber architecture and turf architecture of the site. As the excavations continued, we removed the raft and took it away for sampling and actually got into the belly of the ditch. And in the ditch, the preservation layers were completely sensational. We pulled out this little piece of a Roman dog, still with the hair attached to it. A little spaniel or the equivalent been thrown into the ditch. We got the grain and seeds, still visible by the naked eye, no microscope needed here, still surviving in the soil, and stable flies and beetles still perfectly preserved in the mud. As we excavated through the sides of the ditches and to the ditches' bases, we started encountering other wonderful artifacts too. This is one of our excavators, Dolores, and she's very happy, you can see there, because she's just found this incredible wickerwork basket. And when we think of wood and other material, very often we don't think of things like wicker, which must have been one of the most popular, most common types of material to be used at the site. But even that is so fragile that it has a huge job surviving even in anaerobic conditions. But here, preserved in the ditch mud, this little wickerwork basket, which may have been an eel catching basket, was found, beautifully excavated and recovered. Textiles, bits of cloth and clothing, but you can still see here the weave and somebody's stitched repair coming out of the ground too. And this stuff is incredibly rare, but again, what preserves wood, particularly in anaerobic, very often preserves other materials as well. And of course, leather. It couldn't be a talk about the wooden underworld of Vindolanda without a little nod, at least, to the over 5,500 shoes that have come from the site and continuing to come, and the light that they shed on the people of Vindolanda. Of course, not all of those shoes are leather shoes, and we'll get onto some wooden ones a little bit later. Now, of course, managing water was a big issue for the Romans, as it is for us today when we excavate the site. And you can see here some of the surviving wooden water pipes that came from the excavations. This water pipe is just finishing its conservation in the lab, and I'm very, very hopeful that over the course of the next year, this will go on to display in the museum in the Wooden Underworld exhibition. So fingers crossed, that'll be out of the lab and on display in the next 12 months. And of course, everyday items like wooden spoons and spatulas, the stuff you'd find in your kitchen drawer. Well, the Romans have those, and yes, they drop them, and yes, we find them. And okay, they may be mundane, but to hold something in your hand like that, and the last person that held that, died 1,900 years ago, you make a connection. That's a very, very special thing. And for a lot of our volunteers and excavators and specialists and archaeologists who work on this material of the site, being able to see something like this or hold it or work on it or excavate it brings the hairs on the back of their necks up. And it makes those special connections between two human beings over a huge amount of time. And of course, tent pegs. The Roman army are always on the move, and from our northern ditches of the forts, we found 30 or 40 Roman tent pegs, a mixture of different materials and woods, different styles. Why they were all tossed away, I'm not sure, but we probably will end up with hundreds and hundreds before we finish the excavations of the site. And again, it shows you that although we're working on what should be a semi-permanent base, there's always a mobile element of the Roman army and what it got up to. Now, we talked about wooden artifacts, we talked about ditches, wet environments, anaerobic. We talked about ramparts, but I want to show you some of the special material that can come out of rampart material, rampart sections at Vindolanda and the site, and how beautifully crafted and put together they were. This area marked in blue here is a section of the rampart that crossed this fort ditch, had to go across the timber raft that carried it from slightly slightly later periods. And if we get a close look at it, you can see how beautiful it is and how well it was constructed. In actual fact, this image shows 2 or 3 different rampart sections layered one on top of another, just like the construction of the site itself is. It just so happens that in this particular spot, you can tease out 1 or 2 different layers. And that's what the team from Edinburgh University, who assisted us in the excavation and recording of this section, did. They managed to take this wonderful image and illustration of that rampart raft and mark out the different periods of ramparts and the different types of material used through those periods of time to build Roman forts at Vindolanda. So the one on the bottom here, you can see it's a very different shape to the others, the way they've cut the spade and used it, has a very dark earth attached to it. That's very rich, almost peaty soil. When you get above that, you can see a little layer, I don't know if you can see it very well, but a little layer of wooden branches or posts, making another raft. And then you've got this much more robust turf on top, which is, quite nice stuff. This is slightly later. This is contemporary with the Carealis prize. You get a little bit of rejigging above that, and then you get this rather horrible stuff, which is mainly full of clay above that. And I think what we're seeing here is the Romans over-farming or overusing immediate landscape of the fort, stripping the best materials in the earlier phases. And by the time you get to period 6 here, which is in the Antonine period, so the mid-2nd century, all the readily available good turf for building your ramparts gone. And what are you reduced to? Well, some pretty tatty grass stuck on top of clay. And so you're seeing the environmental impact of the overuse of the landscape of Vindolanda and the changes that forces on Roman construction techniques through time when you look at a rampart like this and its preservation. So let's look at one more area, this area down here, close to where Robin was working, back in the center of the fort. Now here, when we drop down, we're confined by the later structures, very much so, the stone buildings, and we get little pockets of windows into the earlier landscape because of that. The first thing you tend to encounter when you lift the clay foundations up are the spread and demolished remains of the last timber buildings which are squashed or compressed under the ground. Now, unfortunately, the material that comes off the floor here from those buildings has been very close to the oxygen in the higher levels, and so the wood has started to rot or degrade slowly through time before it's been buried. So any artifacts that you get, like this lovely wooden clog that's come from this sort of period, you can see how it started to rot in the ground before it's been covered and before it's been preserved. And you've got a very definite wood rot here on the front of this particular item. But once you uncork the top layer, if you will, of this material, and you start getting a little bit deeper, then the main structures of the building start to appear. The earth gets darker as it gets more anaerobic, and you get a sense of what's going on in that space and how things have been put together. You have the opportunity to look at and study the way buildings were put together, the wattle and daub walls, the construction styles and methods. And unfortunately, you've got a small window to do this. You're fighting against the weather, the elements, the natural groundwater coming through, and the oxygen working its magic on this material to try to make it rot again for the first time in a couple of thousand years. However, amongst this material, some fantastic stuff is preserved. And here we've got one of the partial wooden wagon wheels that came from this excavation in this area. We get far better quality in terms of wooden clogs and other artifacts once you drop down below the interface between the clay layer and the actual main preservation parts of the site. The clay does a job of capping everything, but being next to it is no good for anything sitting in the ground. And then you start to get a much broader range of stuff coming out. The personal artifacts like the wooden cones, which we've discussed earlier on, but also reused barrel staves from the beer barrels that have been brought into Vindolanda that you may have heard a little bit about in Rob's lecture earlier on. Some of them branded like this one in spectacular fashion. You get a sense of the journeys that these vessels have taken, or these containers are taken to get to Vindolanda, and then they're very often reused in the floor or other spaces. Perhaps our favorite find from this excavation in 2015 was, of course, the toilet seat. This magnificent thing, broken, tossed away on the floor. But, I mean, there must have been millions of these things in the Roman Empire. But this is, believe it or not, pretty much the most complete example from Western Europe in this particular period, in the early 2nd century. And unfortunately for us, it was nowhere near the toilet. We couldn't find the toilet, possibly, unfortunately, for the Tungren who dropped it too. But, you know, instantly recognizable. And it makes, again, those connections between the people who lived there 2,000 years ago and the people who are at Vindolanda today. I have to also report this had a very hard life, which is why when you visit it in the museum, although it doesn't quite look as good as this anymore, because the conservation process had a fearful job of preserving this artifact because of all the chemicals and the use that this thing had by the soldiers and the community uses as an everyday item. Those things aren't necessarily good for toilet seats. And of course, the range is awesome. Metal knives with bone handles, complete parts of leather tents and tent panels, and of course, lots and lots of Roman shoes and leather. Now, it's important to point out that we're not just getting material here, as with the writing tablets, that are just for soldiers, for adult men. We're getting a full, broad range of stuff. What I'm holding in my hand here is a child's shoe or slipper, and it was found inside a barrack in the wooden underworld of Vindolanda. Now, this has been so important for changing our perceptions of the nature of the Roman army, what sort of people you could find in those spaces. Footwear like this, writing tablets, the material coming from those levels combined gives us a completely different picture of life 2,000 years ago on the frontier. But one would always hope when you're excavating those spaces that you would uncover more letters. And in 2017, sandwiched between two Severan buildings and dropping down under the timberwork of the earlier forts, this first little fragment held in Alex Meyer's hand, I believe, that he recovered in 2017, was the first of what turned out to be many of an archive left behind by one of the commanding officers at Vindolanda. Now, when you excavate material like this to pull out these tiny slivers, these fragments of letters that are so delicate, you don't use a trowel. What you have to do is to cut the ground into fairly large blocks with a spade, very carefully, by leaning on it, not by putting your foot on it. Withdraw the block of earth, put it on its side, and with gentle pressure with your hands, apply that pressure until the block breaks open. And if there's an object in there that's not natural soil, you'll find it. You may actually slice a writing tablet in half this way, but at least you'll be able to recover it and read it. If you use a trowel, unfortunately, because it's a repetitive motion, the sort of tool we normally use for most excavations, 9 times out of 10, you've got the option of actually removing the writing tablet before your very eyes, before you can do anything about it, which is why we use this technique. Now, once artifacts like this come out of the ground, they either go into containers, which are sealed, or they go into water that comes from the actual excavation trench, which has very little oxygen in it. And so that slows down that process of decay that I've been talking about throughout the lecture. Here we've got reused ice cream tubs. It doesn't really matter what you use as long as it can hold water. And the tablets have gone into there to buy us time to recover them and then send them down to the laboratory at Vindolanda where they go through conservation. Once they're cleaned in the lab, they go in various chemical baths, and different wooden artifacts and different types of material goes through different chemical concoctions or methods to preserve them for display or for storage or for research. The tablets go through a couple of different systems, from methylated spirits to ether, and eventually, of course, when the ether dries off, you end up with a tablet which has very little water in it and is hopefully very well preserved. But this process takes months. So from the excitement of finding something like this on the excavation, one then has to hold your breath or just be patient for sometimes for 3 or 4 months before you get to the next stage, and sometimes even longer. That particular letter that I've just shown you the image of floating around is this one, or part of a letter that goes with this collection. And this is one of the tablets that came from that group. It's a letter from a guy called Masculus to the commanding officer himself, Verecundus, and he's asking for leave for 5 of his men. And then all sorts of little jokey bits at the end there, and wishing his commanding officer good fortune and everything else. It's the personal nature of this document. The fact he's asking for leave, the fact that he's asking for leave for lots of different types of soldiers from different sorts of regiments and ethnic backgrounds, who are all clearly serving together at Vindolanda as part of a Tungrian regiment, which is so interesting. It unlocks different avenues for research and interpretation and ways of looking at the Roman army. Unfortunately, the knife we showed you before probably isn't the cleaving knife that he's referring to in this letter, but it'd be lovely to think that it's still at Vindolanda, somewhere where we can find it, and hopefully it's nothing to do with the castration shears that Virilis lost earlier on either. On the back of the tablet, which is about the size of a modern day postcard, you can see the address script, and here it just says Julius Verecundus, or Verecundo, who is the commanding officer of the First Court of Gauls, First Court of Tungrians. So again, wonderful sort of stuff. Now, recent excavations have focused on different areas of the site. And if you come and visit Vindolanda today, you'll find us working in this space here. And we've been working very hard with a team of volunteers over the last 2 or 3 years, with a pandemic break, unfortunately, to work our way through the 5th century, the post-Roman material, the 4th century, and work our way down so that we're in a position once more towards the end of this coming year, 2022, to go back into the wooden underworld of Vindolanda. So this is where we're up to at the moment, more or less. We've got 3rd century buildings, 4th century barracks, 5th and 6th century cobbled yards, and we've removed some of the later post-Roman buildings here. 2nd or late 2nd, early 3rd century roundhouses. And under all of this, just next door to where Roman found the Praetorium of Flavius Cerialis, we would be hoping during the course of this summer to get back into the wooden underworld. And one of the most exciting things about this area, this space, is that we've got all 9 Roman forts stacked on top of each other here in this part of the site, giving us incredible layers of preservation and that protection which the ground needs to be able to have that sort of survival level over the next 2,000 years, and for us to be able to look at, record and recover that information. Now, I have to say thank you to the wonderful team of volunteers who take part on the excavations. They come from all over the world, all sorts of different backgrounds, walks of life. The excavations are directed by myself and Marta Alberti, who we've got in the foreground here, and ably assisted by Penny Trickler as well. And of course, the lab and the team and the specialists and our other visiting specialists, Beth, Alex, and others who come and give so much of their time to the work. But we couldn't do any of it without this incredible team of dedicated volunteers who spend, some of them, decades of their lives on the site, bringing their expertise, their enthusiasm and their spirit to the work that takes place. So I want to really leave us tonight honouring and thanking those people for their work that they do, and also encouraging you to come along and look at the wooden underworld in the museum, but also get on the website, as Annika said, and check out the exhibition online, because that online exhibition is full of stories by people who excavated, been inspired, or worked on this material, and you'll get some really lovely insights into what it is like to work at the site, to be associated with the site, and to be inspired by the stuff that comes out of the ground. Thank you very much.